Hello, hello. Good afternoon, good evening, good day, depending on what time you are watching this live stream, whether you are catching it live or you are catching the replay. Thank you all so much for joining me on today. So, we're going to go ahead and get straight into it. We are talking about untitled leadership and performative leadership. Our title or our topic of today is Untitled Leadership is Not Performative Leadership. And with that, there's a question that we are essentially going to surround everything that we speak about on. And that question is, what does leadership look like when you don't have authority? So, what does leadership look like when you don't have authority? Now, over the next 15 minutes, we are going to cover some confusion, some myths, and even top three ways in which individuals with untitled leadership are able to express that. But before we get into that, I think it's important, number one, to introduce myself and then talk a little bit about what performative leadership and untitled leadership is. So, for those of you who do not know who I am, my name is Lepora Lindsay, and I go live every Sunday at 5:30 Central Time, speaking about professional development topics and workplace value. Now, when we're talking about untitled leadership, essentially what this is any professional who is leading without formal authority. In a sentence, I would say that that's what sums it up. And when we talk about performative leadership, essentially performative leadership is about us positioning ourselves in a way to we're completing actions, but the actions isn't about progress. It is about what looks good, what is visible, what can easily be seen. So that's performative leadership. And workplace value is where both of these things fall under, because workplace value is about how your contribution, your efforts, how that is translated over in the workplace. And so the goal is, regardless of wherever you are within an organizational structure, how can you create an impact? How can you contribute in a way that you're not just putting forth work and effort, but you're doing it so that the individuals in your team, department, whatever the case may be, they see the benefit in what you do. And a lot of times that boils down to how it's being translated. All right, y'all. So I told y'all we only have 15 minutes to talk about this today, and we're talking about untitled leadership. And the question that we are going to be focusing in on is, what does leadership look like when you don't have formal authority? So number one, or one of the important things that I really want you to think about, is that when we think about leadership, specifically leadership without a title, it's important to recognize that leadership without a title is not about being louder, it is about being different. So leadership is not about, without a title, is not about being louder, it is about being different. There is so many different inputs and information out there that talks about leadership, untitled leadership, from the stance of, be louder, you have to speak up more often. And while that is one way, that is not the only way. It is um it is about, not it's not necessarily about always being visible, but it is about three things: pattern creation, it is about contribution consistency, and it is about decision clarity. And we'll talk a little bit about those. But first, let's get into the assumption piece. So, the assumption piece is that when you are an untitled leader, you have to be more visible, you have to be more loud, you have to be more confident, you have to do more, 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 more. But that doesn't all of the time equate to being a leader, especially when we're talking about in an informal capacity. Like, how are you leading on a daily basis? It's not just about those things, because in always trying to do more, you're going to end up burning yourself out. You're going to end up exhausting yourself. You're going to become a lot more tired because you're doing more and you're not in a leadership role, and you're wondering, well, when am I going to get my reward for all of this leadership skills and actions that I'm taking part in. So keeping that in mind. And so that means that when we think about emails, it's not about who can send the most emails. It's not about who is leading the presentation or who is leading the meeting. It's not about over functioning. It is about pattern creation. It is about decision clarity and contribution consistency. And I forgot to mention earlier on, but as you're logging in and you're catching this live stream, you can feel free to type in the chat if you have questions or if you have comments on anything that I share here today. Feel free to chime in. I absolutely love hearing from you all, whether it's during the live or after the live. It's good to know that I'm not here alone, but that there is a good group of you who are tuning in. So yes, feel free to comment and ask questions. So what we're talking about here is what untitled leadership can look like. So we've already talked a little bit about what it isn't, but let's talk about what it is. So that first thing is pattern creation. So pattern creation is essentially, when we think about this, is what keeps happening because someone is taking action, or what is a repeatable process. And when you can identify that, that is untitled leadership. That is one of the many ways that untitled leadership shows up. It also shows up with decision clarity. And decision clarity is essentially what becomes easier because someone has a knowledge base on it, or making decisions not just based on your role or your project, but making decisions based on the bigger picture. So that's decision clarity. And when someone has that and you're not in a formal leadership capacity, that is untitled leadership. The third way that we can identify untitled leadership is contribution consistency. So, what reliably moves things forward? What is creating progress over and over, or who is creating progress over and over? That is untitled leadership. And you'll notice that with none of these things was, being louder mentioned, was being more visible mentioned, but it's about moving things forward. It is about that workplace value, not just contributing, but contributing in a way that the individuals, the professionals that you work with, see it as a benefit as well. So when we're talking about this, sorry, y'all. When we're talking about this, most individual contributors, or if you are in an unofficial leadership role, more than likely you're already doing these things that I've listed here today. This isn't something that's new to you. It is what the challenge may be is that you may find that the system that you're in or the organization may not currently recognize the actions that you're taking, but it's important for what I've noticed is that when individuals are able to identify what they do, they are able, or what the organization needs, they are able to translate that in a way that is beneficial, that is not just for them, but for the team as a whole. So because individuals are doing this and they're not necessarily seeing the rewards or the benefit, there are some frustrations. That frustration is going to live there. It's going to live in a mindset of, I'm not a leader because the system or the organization doesn't recognize what I do. I'm not a leader because the system or the organization doesn't recognize what I do. And that gap is where that frustration is. And what research has shown, there was a couple of Harvard Review business articles that have spoken about how when we're talking about, or when we're even defining leadership, it is not just the visibility, but it is the connection factors. It is the glue. What is something that is going to build trust? What is something that is going to build connection? And one of the workshops that I offer, I talk about the six elements of influence, without authority. And one of them is that relationship building. And the reason why I bring it up is because none of those elements are about how we can always be seen. And what I've noticed, and I'll talk a little bit about this later on through this week, is that we oftentimes look at contentment and ambition as being two separate entities. I can't be content with where I am and still look forward to what happens next. But there is a balance there that can be when we learn how to take the work that we do and translate it in a way that can be beneficial. All right, I don't have any questions. I don't see any questions here or comments, but I always appreciate you all tuning in. But as I prepare to close out, I will say this. We, as a workforce as a whole, one of the things that I've noticed is that if we keep telling people to step up, if we keep telling people to speak up, but we aren't paying attention to the ways in which they've already done it, the ways in which they've already demonstrated their leadership, untitled leadership. We have to take notice as to how that could potentially affect the work that they will consistently do, the efforts that they will consistently put forth. And if you are someone who is consistently putting forth that effort, just looking at ways in which it can be translated, I think is absolutely essential to not deal with that exhaustion and that burnout. And I think that this is something that is worth sitting with, worth thinking about, worth maybe even having a little tension with, is what do we do? Where do we go from here? When we go back to that question at the beginning, what does untitled leadership look like? What does it look like for you? What does it look like for your organization? And what are ways in which we can move that progress forward without it being louder, without it being visible, but what are other opportunities that are available there? All right, y'all. So that is all that I have for you today. I I appreciate you all so much for tuning in and for messaging throughout the week, or if I see you in person, I always appreciate um, the insights that you share, or even the questions that you have at that point. And I can't say that enough. It means a lot to me whenever y'all are tuning in and supporting me in whatever way you can. So thank you all so much for your time. And one thing that I absolutely want you to remember is to please just stay adding value. All right, y'all. You have a good one. You have a great rest of your day today, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your week. Bye.